Many people in the Black conscious community have great difficulty understanding why more Black people won't work for independence from white supremacy. We tend to mistake addiction to the comforts afforded by white supremacy for love, of servitude, to white supremacy. There is a great self-destructive power in comfort, so great in fact that, as the Akawu tells us, comfort is the enemy of revolution. In other words, the more comfortable one is, the less likely that one will be willing to change. Many of us that are conscious of the fact that these comforts are self-destructive allow ourselves a moderate degree of indulgence. Others that are aware of the damaging effects indulge at a greater degree. Those that are unconscious tend to overindulge. It's not abnormal for people to be attached to the sense pleasures or, at the very least, indulge intermittently. Each individual has his or her own sense pleasure preferences. In fact, as the Buddha reminded us, even the most intelligent among us have a certain degree of attachment to the sense pleasures. White supremacy slave culture permits the oppressed to satisfy most of their tastes. In reality, it's the permission and freedom to indulge in the sense pleasures that most influences the masses of people to defend this otherwise oppressive society. So, comfortable oppression is more attractive to those addicted to this slave culture than uncomfortable freedom. The greater the detachment from the sense pleasures, the greater the desire to be free, even if that might mean some comfort will have to be sacrificed. With that said, there are very few of us that are willing to give up the comforts we've grown accustomed to, for freedom. Many of the conscious among us are under the illusory fantasy that upon hearing, quote, the word, unquote, of true Black power, in the language of Christianity, they will be born again and immediately take up the fight for Black liberation. Each generation of conscious Black folks erroneously believes that they are the first truly conscious generation that lived since the Caucasian escaped from his European prison. Ironically, this so-called great knowledge that we attain tends to divide us further and further from the very Black people we claim to love so much and want to see liberated. As we adopt new terminology, for example, we allow ourselves to be divided by said terminology. Using the word understand instead of overstand even divides us. Too funny. The more we learn, the less we tend to think that Black unity is possible. This is because most of the historical documents that we tend to study are the white supremacists' interpretation and perspective of history. And since we've been trained to regurgitate information, without thinking, we usually don't analyze it. If we look at the historical record of Florida, for example, European-trained scholars call that area Spanish Florida. This is the white supremacist version and interpretation of history. I'm sure our indigenous ancestors that lived in that area, before they were brainwashed, did not call their land Spanish Florida. Neither did they even recognize European claim of ownership of their land. But, today, we regurgitate, quote, Spanish Florida, as if to say, of course, we are well aware that Florida belonged to the Spanish. Likewise, today, we ignore the fact that almost all of us are already united. No matter what we say our differences are today, the majority of us are unified under white supremacy. The Akawu tells us that the so-called devil says eat, and the people eat. It says drink, and the people drink. It points its finger and the people attack. You can find the Black Christian, Muslim, and atheist, with all of their different ideologies, all fighting in unity in the white man's military. But in order to fight in the Black Liberation Army, the so-called awakened among us tend to say, we can't do that until we have the same ideas and beliefs. Today, the masses of so-called African Americans, whether they be Christian, Hebrew, Muslim, atheist, scholars, illiterate, poor, or rich, will celebrate Halloween in unity. For several years I personally financed a movement to create and develop Black celebratory holidays. Again, most African Americans were opposed to creating something that focused on redeveloping our own culture and self-love. I offered to pay the most creative among us, the children, to help develop these celebrations. But the parents would come up with every reason why we shouldn't, couldn't, or won't develop our own cultural practices. I point out often that if, with all our differences, we can unify under the single idea of white supremacy, certainly we can unify under the single idea of Black liberation. But our education in white supremacy ideology tells us that, again using Christian doctrine, all things, including black unity, are possible, but only under the banner of white supremacy. Dr. John Henrik Clarke told us that, it is through understanding the nature of our difference that we grow, because we discover that we don't differ as much as we think. You need to think about that. This article was written by Daku Akabo wa Akatu.